Alright, in this video, I'm going to, let's see if I can make this a little more realistic. What I'm going to do is, oh, I can't do that. Sorry about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a video walking you through this programming activity for Module 5. So this is a little bit different from what we've done before, because we are going to make two files, one called student.java and the other we're going to call janedoe.java. You'll see how this works. So the whole point of this activity is that we are introduced to the idea of object creation. So I posted a video, which I did not make. Both of these videos actually are another gentleman who kind of explains concepts related to this module. So he talks about the difference between a class and an object in programming. Does a pretty decent job explaining that. And that's kind of what we're talking about here with what we're going to do. So here's my folder where I store all my Java projects. Notice that for each Java file that I've created so far, there is also a .class file. Now, I did not make that .class file. That was generated when I ran the file in JGrasp. Now, this to me is a little bit confusing because a .class file is not really the code that includes a class. Let me explain what that means. So we've been making, like for example, here's grammar. So grammar is a public class. This is a .java file. This file right here is grammar.java. And when I run grammar.java, this grammar.class is created by the Java interpreter and compiler. So just be aware that this .class file is something that is created based off the .java file. So I do not, you will not be submitting a class file. You're submitting a Java file. So we're dealing with Java files. So the Java file actually has the definition of a class. It's kind of confusing. It's just the way the Java gods made things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new Java file. I'm actually going to make two Java files ultimately. Now, you would still have at the top, you would have block comments. I'm not going to do that to try to save some time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a public class called student. So what I'm really doing here is I'm making a file that is really kind of a blueprint when I want to generate a student. So think about you as a student at FCC. What are requirements for information about you? Of course there's going to be your first name, your last name, your address, your city, state, zip code, your gender, your major, all kinds of information about you. So we're going to kind of condense that for scalability because of limits of time. I'm trying to make this video quickly so we can fit it in. But I'm just going to pick a few main things here. So I'm going to say that this student is going to have a couple main attributes. One is going to be the student's ID. You all have an ID, which that ID is an integer. I'm also going to have a name. Now, we would have first name and probably last name. I'm just going to use first name for now. And then I'm also going to store a GPA. Now, realistically, again, for a student, you would have way more information than this. I'm just trying to pick out some key attributes just to show you how a blueprint of a student class would work. So what we are doing is we are creating, it's kind of a guide to follow. When we want to enroll a student at FCC, what information do we need? We're going to need the student ID, the name, and the GPA. So this is essentially defining what information we're going to need. It's not actually giving it information, it's creating the attributes of what we would need. So we need a private, come back to this, a private integer called ID. So it's going to be for the student ID. We're also going to need a private string called name. And we're going to need one more private double called GPA. Now each of these are ID, name, and GPA. These are instance variables. In other words, when we enroll a student, we're going to enroll Jane Doe here in a few moments. When we enroll Jane Doe, we're going to give Jane Doe her own unique ID, the name Jane, and a GPA. They are each private because the only way we want this information for Jane, or any other student for that matter, to be accessed is that we want it to only be accessed by certain Java files. So these three things are attributes or instance variables for a student. We're defining what information we need for any student. So when we create a student, we need to build a student. We're going to need a public function, we're going to need a public method, I should say, that will build a student. So it's going to be a method called student, and it is a method, so it has a left and right parenthesis. So a method is a process that occurs. When we create one of these things, we have to have some kind of process that tells Java how to build one of these things. This is a process, so it needs curly brackets at the beginning and end of it. So what do we want to have happen when we build a student? So by default, we're going to say that a student is going to have the ID number 0, which is an integer. We're going to give the name, we're going to say it's an empty string. You'll see how this works. And then we're going to have a GPA, which we're going to set to 0.0. So when we create a student, when we enroll a student, however you want to think of that we're going to say that any old student, when we set aside memory space for a student, the ID is going to be set to 0, name is going to be an empty string, and GPA is going to be 0.0. This is going to be our student constructor. A constructor is a method. It's a special method. It's a special process that builds or constructs one of these things. So what we also want to do is we want to be able to see this information. So if we want to go look up what a student's ID is, or name is, or GPA, we need some way to actually go look this stuff up. So we need to say that we have a public process, a public method to go look up the ID name. So we're going to say that we have a public int called getID, and it is a method, so it has parentheses. And what are we going to do? When we call this process getID, which we know it's a method because it has parentheses, what are we going to do? We're going to send back or return the ID for that student. So this ends the accessor getID. We're accessing information. We're accessing the ID. We're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to copy and paste this to you over time. We're going to do the same thing for, change these, to get the name. And what am I going to return for the name? I'm going to return the string called name. And this is not an int, it's going to be a string. And I'm going to get the GPA, and that's going to be a double, and I'm going to return the GPA. So this whole concept, this whole module really is a very abstract concept. So when I say I want to return the ID, it's going to return the ID value for the student we are working with at this moment. And you'll see how this works here in a little bit. So notice that we are going to look up an integer that we created to get the integer ID. Here we're going to return name, which is a string. And here we're going to return GPA. Hey, it's a double. So this return type has to match the type that you're returning. So it's a string, it's a string, it's a double, it's a double. They must match. So that's the type we are returning. So each of these are accessors where we are getting a value. So the verb get is kind of insinuating what we're doing. We're getting the ID, we're getting the name, we're getting the GPA. Well, we can also set these values as well. So we can say we have a public way to get in and out of this file. This is a public void to set the ID. Also a method where we will set a value. So now what's interesting here is this void is a return type. We're not going to return anything with this method. This method's going to set a value. Well, what is the type for ID? It's an integer. So we need, if we're going to set ID to some value, we need to have some required parameter, some required incoming value. That's what a parameter is. Some parameter to set the ID to. So we're going to say, well, for this method, right here in this method's world, and this is the only place this variable is going to live, we're going to create a temporary int, which I'm going to call I, short for ID. So we're going to say, for this method, we're going to have a variable called I, and we're going to use I, and we're going to say that ID is going to be set to the value of whatever I is. And we're going to do the same process for the name as well as the GPA. So we're going to set name, and what are we going to set it to? I'm going to set it to a string. I'm just going to call it n, and I'm going to say that name is going to be set to n, and then I'm also going to set the GPA. I'm going to make that a double because it has to match. I'm going to say it's G. And I'm going to say that GPA is set to whatever G is. Now, when I create these variables, I and G, I don't have to call them, hey, I and G, I didn't realize that, that's kind of interesting. Didn't plan that. So, when I do this, I can call these whatever I want. Notice I did not call this ID, I did not call this name, didn't call this GPA. I could have. But that to me is going to create some ambiguity, some confusion between the ID instance variable ID and the instance variable for name and the instance variable GPA when compared to this variable that only is going to live right here in this method. I is only going to live right here, and then n is only going to live right here, and g is only going to live right here. So I create these new variable names to be something different than this, because to me that creates confusion. Right, so these are sometimes called mutators, and basically we're changing a value with a mutator and an accessor, so we're looking it up. So we're either changing a value or we're just looking it up. Sometimes they're called getters and setters, because we're getting a value, we're just looking it up, or we're setting, we're mutating, we're changing it. Okay, so this whole thing is going to end the student class. Now there is something missing from this that we do not see here. Nowhere in this file do we see main. Nowhere do we see main. Why is that? Because main is the first thing that Java looks for. It says, hey, where's main? What's main tell me to do? We don't have main here because this is just a blueprint. Think about when you build a house. When you build a house, you can use a blueprint over and over and over again. Every time you want to build a house, you use the blueprint to build a house. So this is kind of the same way. Every time we want to enroll a student, we're going to go use this file for the criteria to enroll a student. Same kind of deal. We have not actually enrolled a student. We need a whole nother file to do that. So this student file, I need to save this, by the way. So I'm going to save this as student.java. The student.java file does not have a main or it's not a driver file. It doesn't have main. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I need a whole nother file to create my other student. So I'm going to go create another file. I'm going to call it janedoe.java. So this is, now I think about it, this is probably not the best naming convention because I'm really going to show you how to create more than one student, but I'm going to roll with it. So again, you would have at the top, do your block comments. I'm not doing that to save time here. I'm going to go down a couple lines just to give myself a little bit of space. Again, I'm going to create a public class, and I'm going to call this Jane Doe. Just be aware I'm also going to create another student or two in here. It's kind of a goofy name, but that's okay. And this is the file where I create students. I'm going to create more than one student here, even though I call it Jane Doe, but that's okay. So I'm going to end the class Jane Doe. And inside here, I'm going to create public static void main. Here we go. Same thing we already know. Public static void main string args. And we're familiar with this. This is where main is. So here, I'm going to start creating students. So a student is an object. So here, I'm going to create a student. I'm going to call Jane, and Jane is a new student. Notice that I'm not setting any values for Jane, because when I go to create a student, Jane's going to be defined. She's going to be given the ID 0, an empty string, and a GPA of 0.0. Whoops, not what I meant to do. So I'm going to go ahead and save this right away, just to make sure I don't lose it. Save this as, call it janedoe.java. Notice that this has to be in the exact same folder as student.java. It's got to be in the same folder. If they're not in the same folder, I'm just not supposed to name Jane Doe. Oh, my bad. So I hit the wrong thing. So this should be, let me do that again. File, save as, Jane Doe, save. Alright, so they have to be in the same folder. Just to show you that again, here's my folder. Student, Jane Doe. They're in the same folder. They have to be. So I'm going to create this new student. Now I can't see anything for Jane. But I can go ahead and run this, and it's going to run just fine. But I'm not doing any output. So if I want to go look up Jane's ID, or Jane's name, or Jane's GPA, I can do that. But what I have to do is I have to say, hey, give me output, give me a system.out.println for, I'll say, Jane ID, and I'm going to say I want to add to this output the ID for a student named Jane. So I'm going to use the dot operator. I'm going to say Jane dot get ID. That is the name of my method, get ID for a student. Get ID for a student. I'm going to get the ID. This thing right here, that method, what comes after the dot, we know it's a method because that's the name of the method, there's the parentheses. That's going to return an ID. So that, what is ID? It's just an integer. That's going to send back. This right here is going to give me a number. It's going to give me a number for this student, the student named Jane. That's what I call her. Excuse me. So when I go to display this, what's this going to display? It should display 0. That's all it should display. And it does. Jane ID is 0. If I want to get Jane's name or GPA, same process, but instead for ID, I'm going to say Jane's name is, and I'm not going to get ID, I'm going to get name. And not ID here, I'm going to get GPA. So now when I run this, I should see 0, empty string, and a GPA of 0.0. And that is exactly what I would expect, because when I do this, I'm saying, hey Java, create memory space for a student object called Jane. Here's your setting side new memory space for that student. And this right here is a method. This is calling the constructor for student. It's going to go build one of these things. When it goes and finds a constructor, here's what it finds. It finds this. And this constructor says, create a student's ID with a number 0, an empty string called name, and a GPA of 0.0. So watch what happens for Jane. When I say, I want Jane's ID, I'm going to set her ID. I'm going to set it to 999. That's an integer, right? And I'm going to set Jane's name. Probably makes sense to set it to Jane, right? And I'm going to set Jane's GPA to something like, I don't know, 3.2. So now, since I've set these values, if I call the accessors after I set them, after I mutate them. Watch what happens. I'm going to save this, run it, and now down here, the first time I run it, I get 0, empty string 0.0, and then after I set them, I get 999, Jane, and 3.2. And that is exactly what I want, because I'm saying for this student object called Jane, I want to get the ID, I want to get the name, I want to get the GPA. I can create another student. Now this is a little goofy because the name of the file is Jane Doe. But just to show you I could do more than one student, I'm going to create, well, we'll call it Sally. And Sally is also a new student. And look what I can do. I can do the same thing for Sally. I'm going to do Sally ID. And I can do the exact same thing. Whoops. It has to match exactly, by the way. Nah, capitalization is bad. Well, it's not bad, it's just it has to match exactly. Because I called the student Sally. So now, when I have not set Sally's value, so now when I run this for Sally, I should see 0, empty string, and GPA of 0.0. And that is exactly what I see. See, Jane's changes, but Sally's just like Jane was, because I haven't set those values. So the whole idea here is this is a blueprint or a guide that we follow for when we enroll or create a student, and this is where we would be creating our students. Now again, I call it a Jane Doe. I could have just called this students. Is probably what we could have done. So what you are to do with this assignment is sort of what I just did, is I basically just walked through this with you. You're going to create a class named student that creates an integer called student ID, a name, a string name, a double GPA with a constructor and a mutator and a name for GPA. Well, actually, I did more than this. I did a mutator and accessor for all of these, which is, you don't even have to do all that because you just need a mutator for name and GPA. I did all three, ID, name, and GPA. Now, you do need an accessor for all three attributes. So here's the thing. I want you to submit the files. This is a little bit different because you're submitting 2 files. So what I'm going to ask that you do here is just create a folder. And I would not create it in your JGraphs folder. But you want to create a separate folder where you copy your Jane Doe and your student, not class, sorry, your Java files. Make sure you have your Java files for Jane Doe and student. Copy and paste those in another folder. So here I'm going to make a folder. I'll call this, mod 5 act. I think that's what I asked for, don't I? Mod 5 Java act. I'll call it what I asked for. Follow your own rules, Mr. Cell. So mod 5 Java act. And what am I going to put in there? I'm going to copy Jane Doe and student. I'm going to copy the Java files. And I'm going to paste them in here. And now what I need to do is I need to zip this folder. Zip it on up. I'm going to right click and I can send to, so I'm on a Windows computer. I don't know what's like on a Mac or Linux. But I'm going to send to a compressed zip folder. Notice I also have 7-zip, which is another really cool way to do this, but you may not have that installed. So that will create a zip folder and I can send that folder. So what I'm looking for is a zipped folder when you send this in. You're going to do something very similar for your programming, I didn't spell activity right, for your exercise for this module as well, and you'll see that as well here in Module 5. Good luck.